All right, ladies and gentlemen. Actually, I don't know if I'm allowed to say ladies and gentlemen anymore. The MTA is getting rid of that. So maybe,
Sure.
hey, you people of New York and all around the world, this is New York HR. I am excited. My partner in crime is not here today, Steve Levy. We miss you, Steve. We'll see him on Monday. We have another event scheduled for Monday, so we'll see you, Steve, soon. But that's okay. I've been carrying the weight for a while. So I'm excited to have our guest today, Barry Marshall. Barry was a former VP of people operations at Axial, has a really wonderful background in financial services, working for some large companies, working for some startups. What I hear is an Army brat, so maybe not technically a New Yorker by birth, but he's here with us. Barry, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Great to be here, Anthony.
Great to have you. Thanks for us coercing you to be on the show and the briberies and all that stuff. But it is New York, so
yeah, true.
So Barry, interesting is I kid around with the MTA, but obviously running and working in financial services. Obviously, New York is the place to be there. You have a strong background there, and then doing some startups. But tell us a little bit. In the show, for those of you that are just watching for the first time, what we like to do is talk about the background. So we don't know where you're going unless we know where you've been. So we ask our guests to talk a little bit about where they're from, how they made the move to New York, and then of course their career in HR. So why don't we start there, Barry? Where are you from originally? I know you said you were an Army brat, so you moved around a little bit, and then how'd you wind up here in New York?
Yeah, cool. I said, so technically I'm an Air Force brat.
Air Force brat. Okay, fair enough.
So I was born in San Antonio, Texas. I think I lived there for all of 6 months or so. And then moved around obviously every 6 to 18 months or so. As a kid, lots of different states, almost basically all domestic postings. My parents divorced when I was 6, and they had joint custody, and both my father and stepfather were Air Force. So they were moving, I was moving, and I was going back and forth a little between the parents. So as a result of that, I've been physically in every state but Alaska.
Huh, no kidding.
Yeah, I have to check that off my bucket list at some point.
But, I have to get there. I mean, come on. It's just like, let's go tomorrow because you just got to check that off. Yeah,
exactly. And then ended up, the longest time I spent anywhere as a kid was like junior high school was in Kansas. My stepdad retired when we moved there. So kind of, small town, Kansas, 8,000 people in the city, high school of about 400 kids. So graduated from high school there.
Any specific memories, any place that sort of just other than sort of the high school that you're like, yeah, that was actually one of my favorite places. Again, as a kid, you probably don't remember too much, but
yeah, it's interesting. They were all, sort of, I think you quickly learn as a military brat to sort of experience every sort of place that you are, and sort of appreciate each of those unique locations, and whether it's the Midwest or the Southwest or the Southeast, or Mississippi or Missouri or Ohio or Florida, Texas. And I think you basically, I don't know that I have anyone that I would say, oh, that was my favorite, other than we'll get to this, but New York City is my favorite.
Good answer, by the way.
Yeah. But I think you learn to sort of appreciate each location, as being unique, and you have to, because you're moving around all the time. So that concept of sort of being exposed to new concepts and pushing the envelope and getting comfortable quickly with a place and sort of absorbing it and being sort of, intentional about being there. If you don't do that, you're not going to thrive as a kid.
Sure.
So I don't really have sort of one place I would pick as favorite from a kid perspective.
When you're on Florida HR, Florida will be your favorite place. So all right. So you're moving around a lot. You're an Army brat. You're a military brat, Air Force. How'd you get into HR? Was it, you're in high school in Kansas, and then I think you went to Arizona State. How'd you get into HR? Did you study HR in college?
It's a funny thing, actually. It was so my undergrad was in business with an emphasis in HR, but it was really 19 years later that I actually sort of had my first sort of role in an HR capacity.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
so the journey for me into that was while I was at Arizona State, started working for JP Morgan. It was called the Chase Manhattan Bank back then, many mergers ago.
Huh.
And through that process, just sort of kept taking on different roles, and ultimately ended up getting transferred to New York with JP Morgan.
Cool.
Again, a whole bunch of roles from an operational, risk management, project management, Six Sigma, global ops, a little bit of data warehouse and technology stuff mixed in there.
Sure. Now, how did you get, so you have a business degree, minor, or, concentration in HR, and now you're doing risk, and I see there's, some operation stuff there. Like where'd that happen? Like how'd you make that transition?
Yeah, the first role that I took with him, so my first job while still in college, working part-time for JP Morgan, was I just took a job I could get because they had recently relocated some office facilities to right outside the campus of Arizona State. I took a job as a part-time collector. So I was working part-time in an operations environment as a collector, just paying bills and getting through school. And ultimately liked what I was doing, and liked, working for JP Morgan. And that just I just sort of kept taking new and interesting jobs. And some of them were of my choice. Some were sort of tapped on the shoulder and said, "Hey, why don't you take a look at this?" And I wouldn't say that, that it was I didn't have a charted out trajectory.
Right. None of us do, by the way.
Exactly. I think some kids these days do, which is impressive, but it certainly wasn't for me.
Right.
So, I wasn't really looking for the HR path per se. And that's sort of why I didn't really, it just didn't sort of come back to that until later in my career.
Sure. Now, how did you get back into HR? Because you've done a bunch of different risk and operational roles.
Yeah.
Where was the pit? Like, what happened? Because it's always curious, right? Because, I think there's a lot of folks that either take HR in college and sort of make that trajectory. And I think, for a lot of younger folks, but some of the older folks that are in HR, it's accidental in some cases. Sometimes it's recruiting is a path up. Sometimes it's directly, you're educated in HR and you go in that path. But for the most part, it's accidental to a certain degree. How did that happen for you?
Yeah. So the story for me really goes back to it kind of comes out of an operational role that I had. So back in 2005, I relocated to the Philippines with JP Morgan. I was first person on the ground, tasked with building an operations center from scratch.
Wow.
So for roughly the first 2.5 years, I built, ran, and owned everything that was happening. The second part of it, the last 2.5 years, was really sort of a GM COO capacity to oversee the expansion of what we're doing in country.
And just to give people an idea, how big are we talking about? Like, you were first on the ground, but at the end of it, how big was the operations there?
Yeah. So over the course of 5 years, when I left, it was 9,500 people.
Wow. I mean, that's scale. Wow. So did you have any knowledge of the local talent marketplace, or you were completely green and they're like, "Hey, let's send Barry. He says yes. He says yes to everything. He's like Mikey. Let's give it to, but yeah, Barry, go." But did you have any knowledge of the marketplace, or you're sort of on the ground and you had to learn?
Yeah, pretty much learning from scratch. I'd been there I think before I moved there, I'd been there like a couple of months prior for a business trip to see some vendor stuff that was happening. But I wasn't like I was trained up on sort of, local culture, local talent.
We're going to throw you in the deep end and you're going to go, wow. All right. Yeah. So so now you're scaling up to 9,000, and how many years did it take you?
So it took 5 years.
5 years. So quick growth.
Yeah.
What were some of the challenges there? And then obviously we can transition to your move to New York. But what were some of your challenges? I mean, it's very rare that you get someone who has built an operations in the Philippines. Like, what's some of the things that you learned by doing that?
Yeah. So, challenge number one was sort of no one knew who we were. So from a branding perspective, here Chase branches are everywhere, right? Everybody knows the Chase brand, or they probably know the JP Morgan brand, but nobody knew who we were, right? So number one is we had to sort of establish who we were in the marketplace as from an employer branding perspective.
Which is fascinating, right? Because I think, to me that my mind's boggled when you said that, because I'm like, of course everyone globally knows Chase, right? Like everyone, but there are places where there's no brand presence. It's interesting.
Yeah. So that was definitely challenge number one, I think. And then kind of related to that was, how do we go attract great talent to this brand that, you know, nobody's heard of before, right? And so that was sort of, and then the third piece of that was, as part of that talent attraction, how do we want to differentiate ourselves in the marketplace? Like, who are we going to be in this market as an employer?
And how'd you guys do that? So you have to differentiate. You have no brand. What are some of the things that you put in place?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing was really listening to the people that we were talking to and asking questions about the current marketplace. So, you know, as we had talent coming in the door, interviewing for some of the early roles, really sort of listening as in-depthly as we could to understand what were they looking for, why were they looking, what were they missing, and what wasn't in the marketplace, and is there an opportunity for us to sort of meet that employer branding need in the marketplace? And I think the thing that we found that did make a difference for us in the ability to grow that quickly was to isolate that that the marketplace at the time, this was back in 2005, was filled with a lot of third-party outsource providers. And the nature of engagements in those kind of operational environments is such that you come in and you have a very specific task because it has to be defined, right? Because you've got, you know, the hiring entity, you've got sort of the third-party company in the middle, and then you've got the person actually doing the work. So if you're working in that environment, you have a specific task, and you've got to get that specific task done. But you're never exposed to the rest of the company or other people doing other tasks, right? It's very myopic in that sense, right? And so you had these smart, intelligent, college-educated, passionate people who were kind of in these very myopic roles. And we said there was a lot of turnover in that industry. And so we sort of isolated.
Operational. What were the roles that you were looking for down there? Was it
initially we went in at, you know, sort of on like data entry and early early stage customer service, kind of like easy, like soft touch points for customer interactions.
Sure.
But then we built that up over time to get super complicated to like derivatives, collateral management on the treasury side. Complex tax
jobs. I have no idea what you just said, by the way. But
it's like super sophisticated, and so the full spectrum of stuff.
By the way, my wife was in financial services and used to talk about it, and like my eyes would glaze over. I'm like, I have no idea. You're full of acronyms, this entire industry. Like, and then, by the way, the best thing I love The Big Short, when they bring in. You ever see that movie? And they bring in other celebrities to, like Anthony Bourdain, to explain what like, I love that. I was like, that's fantastic. Anyway, but God, there was something to do with derivatives, but it was more complex than the original data entry. That's what I just
exactly. Yeah, but what really mattered and what really resonated in that market was to say, look, you're coming to not work for somebody that works for somebody else. You are going to be working for JP Morgan, right? You're working for us. And we will expose you to the business. We want you to understand who does work before you get your job and who does work after you do your job, and understand why your role is important, why it matters to the customer, why it matters to the company. We're going to teach you all of that and keep you engaged in the process. And so that really resonated with people, and other companies, because of the nature of what they're doing, couldn't offer that.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sure you probably changed the game down there in terms of how people were approaching talent. So now you scale to 9,000 in an area that you're obviously not familiar with, and now they're like, great job, Barry. Come back to New York. We need more help here. How'd you wind up back here in New York?
Yeah. So I did all that sort of really kind of operations perspective. I had ownership of HR, but I wasn't in HR. It was one of the things I was looking after. Came back to New York because you're basically like, hey, look, you've been there a long time. It's time to move on to the next thing. And I was ready for the next thing. Came back into a strategy role. Side note, most companies don't do great with repatriation. No. I think the statistics are something like close to 80% of people who've been an expat, once they're repatriated, within 2 years, they leave.
Really? Why? Why do you think that happens?
They don't know what to do with you. Yeah, they don't know what to do with you, because typically in expat roles, you've got really, really broad responsibilities and exposure. And then when you come back to sort of, the big sort of mothership, it's sort of like they don't know what to do with that talent.
Got it. So you're out there being a generalist. You come back into where it's, you know, because over there you're establishing processes and the entity. You're back here, it's already done. Processes set up, entities set up, and it's like you're sort of, you know, you're a switch hitter and they're not sure where do we put you in the lineup. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So I came back into this like kind of holding role, which was like a strategy job within the investment bank side. Kind of helping them with some things. It just wasn't an exciting role. So during that process, I was continuing to network for the next thing. And during my time in the Philippines, I'd gotten to know the head of HR at JP Morgan, John Donnelly, really well. And he called me up and he's like, hey, since you left the Philippines, some things in HR have kind of gotten a little crazy. And we need some help, and the executives who oversee it don't have time to go out there and have never been there. So why don't you come into HR and help us fix these two things? Right. And I was looking for my next gig anyway internally. So I'm like, sure. All right, let's do it.
And how long was that from when you were doing HR, studying HR in Arizona State to that point? Was it 10 years, 15?
19.
19. Okay.
So a long time.
So you're in. Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yep.
So now you're part of the HR team at JP Morgan Chase. And what, you know, again, and I know you've done, I love to get to some of the startups that you worked on. But it's always interesting as a guy who worked mostly in startups and maybe one or two big companies, not the size of JP Morgan Chase. What'd you learn now in this new role? Because it looks like you went back, you cleaned up whatever needed to be cleaned up, and then they continued to have you within the HR team. Like what were you working on before you left there?
Yeah. So cleaned up the stuff in the Philippines. And then I took on another role, which was building out a team across Canada, South and Latin America, in the HR space, more on the operational end of HR than the generalist end. And in that sort of region of the world, they had kind of been left to do their own thing. And we had teams in Asia and teams in Europe that were sort of kind of coming into the global fold, so to speak. And that this region, so this region needed to be brought into the global fold, which means we had to sort of carve out a specific team to focus on that.
And that's always easy, right? Like they just say, come on in, and they're willing to follow processes. It's a layup, right?
Exactly.
Yep.
So anyway, it was, it had its own set of challenges, but, built up a team of great people, cool. Kind of over a 2-year period, a team of about 20 people across 7-8 different countries.
Where were you located there? Were you in New York operating that?
Correct. Yeah. Based out of New York, and then just traveling quite a bit to the various countries to visit the teams.
Miles, I assume. Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah. But it was, that was sort of, now we've sort of gotten to why and how kind of into the HR space. And it was really then that, kind of from an introspective point of view, that I realized the thing that I had enjoyed the most about building up the Philippines was really the people side of it. And the thing that enabled us to grow that fast, and we had really high employee satisfaction and really high employee retention, particularly for that market. And as I reflected back on why, it really was the culture that we created that fueled the brand reputation, the attraction of talent, the engagement of talent, the retention of talent, and ultimately the impact of that talent on the organization. Because one sort of little side note is that for the Philippine growth, there was never a mandate for any of the businesses to send people to the Philippines, to send work to Manila. It was my responsibility and my boss's responsibility, who sat in New York, to create internal demand, to fill seats and leverage that operational center in the Philippines. So we had to prove that it worked.
When you say culture, right? Because everyone, culture is a hot topic. It's a buzzword now, which is kind of nice. In HR, we've been trying to pitch and talk about culture for quite a while. It's always this softer thing. I even wrote a blog post years ago. Like, culture to me is, it is intertwined into every action, everything that you do. And it's really hard. Like, it's not, most folks think, hey, we're going to put something on a wall and it's going to, let's get some ping pong tables and that's culture. And we know clearly that's not the case. When you say culture and how it was defined there, give me 3 examples of some of the things that you did to really foster that kind of culture.
Yeah, I think, again, what we did was we made it clear from a structure perspective. So number one, I think, there's a lot culture can't be this, it can't exist. Culture in the terms that we're talking about, it doesn't exist in isolation.
Right.
Right. It's an integrated part of how everything is done in the organization. So one example for what we did in the Philippines as an illustration from an organizational design and structure perspective. So while a lot of companies had it structured that the local head of operations had the hard line reporting relationships, that's what was happening as well sort of in these outsourced companies, right? You had one sort of country leader who owned all the responsibilities. We decided to flip that around. And I had the role, which was a dotted line ownership of the local stuff, but everybody who worked in the Philippine operations for JP Morgan reported into wherever their sort of head of the function was. Huh. So whether it was the US or Europe or Asia, it was a hardline reporting relationship. They were part of that team, part of that organization. And so that was a way of sort of where the rubber meets the road, right? Because sure. I wanted those people to feel like it, and that wasn't going to happen unless they actually reported into part the function
of the team. And that means everything from an HR systems perspective was integrated into that team, all the systems, all the email communications, whatever it is, the
training,
settings, everything.
Management, everything.
Yeah. That's interesting. And we're starting to see that functionality happen across organizations now, right? So we call it the hybrid approach, where you're basically hardlined into what, your specific skill set or your team. If you're a technologist, it's a technology group, and then you're dotted line into sort of the local leadership from that perspective. So it seems like you guys were definitely on the forefront of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And it's one example. It made a huge difference for us.
So now you say, this is great. You probably had a pretty decent, salary. If I look at Glassdoor these days, someone in HR at JP Morgan Chase is not struggling to make rent. And you said, you know what? I'm going to throw it all away for a startup, right? Was Trade Desk,
yep.
Was a startup. You're like, I'm so comfortable in what I'm doing. I'm actually going to screw all that stuff up and go with the startup and get some equity that may not be worth anything but the paper it's worth. It's on. Why?
Yeah. At the end of the day, I knew that I had to get back to being close to the action. And, so having had the experience in the Philippines, it was as entrepreneurial as you can get within a massive corporation. Sure. Right. And I wanted the ability and loved that everything I did there had a direct impact. I could see the impact of the decisions and choices and actions we were taking as a team. And, when you're sitting in sort of large corporate mothership, that's harder to do. Yep. Right. And I knew that I wasn't going to get another opportunity, or it would be really exceptional to have another role like that at JP Morgan. So I said, look, the only way I'm going to get back to feeling a sense of purpose and fulfillment for myself is I've got to go to a smaller company. Right. Yep. I've got to go somewhere where, I'm running it, I'm making choices and decisions and seeing that sort of real-time impact on the organization.
And what was Trade Desk? What they do? And are they still around?
Yeah, they've done very well. So I think I joined as, employee 85 or so. And they're in the ad tech space. And they've done a tremendous job at differentiating themselves in that space. Tremendous culture, great leadership team.
So really, that's a big shift. You were in financial services, and then you go into ad tech.
Yeah.
What were some of the chat like when you jumped from one to the other? Like there had to have been a bunch of stuff that you're like, holy cow, this is way different.
Yeah, very different. Initially, so I was their first HR hire.
Okay.
And so and as a small organization, right, there's no team of people behind me. Right.
No, you're doing everything.
You want something done, you got to get it done.
Yeah.
Right. And it was my first time to be the head of HR and sort of had the full spectrum of HR responsibilities. So there was a ton that I had to learn really quickly.
People have to get paid. We got to have benefits. Like we got to recruit people, learning, all this stuff is my responsibility. And I mean, like I always say, you're changing the wheels of the bus as it's moving too, right?
Yeah.
They're probably growing crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think in 1 year we went from, 80 something to 250 during the year that I was there.
Yeah. And so that wasn't enough. You said, all right, I did this startup thing and now I'm going to go do another one.
Yeah. I got my feet wet and sort of plunged right in.
Cool.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it was like I said, it was a great experience for me. I learned a ton there. But the thing that I wanted to do and was really passionate was really sort of driving the culture piece, from a people ownership perspective, and that was not an area that the trade desk needed any help with.
Got it.
So while I had learned a lot, it was a great experience. I knew, again, sort of being reflective and introspective, said, look, for me to get what I want in terms of the next phase for my career is I need to be sort of playing in the culture sandbox and have ownership of that. So I had built up sort of their infrastructure and their team, and knew it was time. I'd left them in good place. We left on very good terms. My son actually works for them.
Oh, no kidding.
So yeah, so it's, left on very good terms. And they didn't really need to replace me until they went public late last year. So they had a couple of years where they didn't, and I could see that, right? So I said, look, I need to go somewhere where there is a need and an opportunity to sort of play and own in that sort of cultural landscape.
Cool. And so tell us, so I know you recently moved into a new role, and we'll get to that point, but at Axial, and I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, now you're jumping over there as VP of People Operations. Quick brief on what that was, and I'd love to get into what you're doing now.
Yeah. Yeah. So Axial is in a fintech SaaS company. Really cool. Yep. Yeah. Really cool. Yeah. So coming back to financial services, that wasn't really my intent. It just sort of happened that way.
Sure. That's how sometimes it happens. Yeah.
Exactly. Really cool concept as a platform and a product focused on capital transactions for the private market and really on the lower middle market. So, these are companies that sort of make up perhaps as much as half of this country's GDP, but they're really underserved when it comes to capital. So if they need money, for growth organically, or if they want to merge or acquire other businesses and grow their organization, or maybe if they want to exit, right? If it's been a family business and it's time to sort of shutter up and sell off to the right organization, sure. All of those capital transactions are super difficult in today's environment because they're all offline. There is no transparency. There is no marketplace for this kind of stuff. And you can't just walk down the street and you can't Google it.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, this platform sort of brings all of those different parties together to create a better, transparent, efficient environment for capital transactions for the lower middle market.
And how did, I would imagine every transaction that took place, or was there a subscription fee? So you're involved, how did their business model work?
Yeah, initially it was subscription. And then once they sort of got to scale, which was really sort of late last year, early this year, shifted to a success fee model.
Got it. Yep. Cool. So now you're there, you're building HR. Now you recently left there, and now you're doing your own thing. I'd love to tell us what's going on.
Yeah. Again, sort of another introspection point. Great time at Axial. Again, learned a ton. Hopefully left some good footprints there from an organizational perspective. And decided to sort of branch out on my own. There's a couple of areas that I've seen in the marketplace where I think there's an opportunity for me to kind of carve out a niche. And really the focus for what I want to do is really looking at the gap between, in the tech space, we often call it people operations instead of HR.
Right.
But really sort of looking at, there's this concept of the G3. It was a Harvard Business Review article. I think it's People Before Strategy was the subtitle of the article. Okay. But it's really looking at sort of the CEO, the CFO, and the CHRO, or the CPO, Chief People Officer, right? As sort of a G3. And you hear a lot of HR people talk about, well, does this job have a seat at the table?
Right.
Right. To me, you're never going to get anywhere with that conversation, but yep. What I do think is that the market is ripe and really, really looking for people or HR professionals that bring value to the table.
Yeah.
Right. But that value to the table is not compliance. It's not fun police.
No.
Right. It is, articulate, business-minded, data-savvy, people-oriented leaders who are just as tied to the bottom line as the CFO. Or the head of sales, right? And is thinking about the talent agenda, the people agenda from that vantage point. And I think there are a number of great people, and you've had a bunch of them on your show. But I think I've talked to several CEOs who I know are looking for this kind of talent, and there's not a dearth of it in, or there's a gap between the current and what we need. And so I think there's an opportunity for sort of the, kind of folks that are coming up in their HR careers to really sort of bring to the table for them, kind of a boot camp sort of approach to building G3 leaders of the future, right? And sort of enabling, empowering them, working through case studies, and not just, it's not sort of like a one-day training kind of thing. It's more of like a 6 to 12 month engagement where there's touch points, and they've got some other people they can network with and kind of build up that skill set for the HR and people leaders of the future. That's
interesting. I mean, it sounds fantastic because I feel like our industry is plagued, and I talk about this all the time, by a lack of innovation. So I feel like, because a lot of the HR jobs require that compliance, that HR background, there's not a lot of opportunity to have new thinking come into the space. And so if there's a way, and so I think there's two pieces of HR in business. One is sort of what I call the plumbing and heating. This is payroll, this is benefits, this is compliance. It's super important to have that stuff work. And it's like the heating and electricity, only when it goes out do you notice it's not there. So super important, but there's a mindset of HR folks that sit in that bucket. And then there's strategic HR. And again, this is sound a little like seat at the table cliche, but there's, thinking about innovation, thinking about taking, and I've been pushing a lot of this in terms of thought process, design thinking methodology, right? So every program, we were doing performance reviews yearly with 60 questions for decades, knowing full well they had no business impact. Nobody wanted to do it. They didn't improve performance, but yet we kept doing them year over year, right? The same people. So I love, you're speaking to the choir when you're talking about going in there as a business professional. That was required of me in every role I did, because as startups, you have to understand the business. I think when you work for larger companies, you can have that, like you talked about, here's your specific role. Right. In HR, you don't necessarily need to know about how the company makes money. You just have to perform these duties. And I think that's fundamentally changing. So I love hearing that. So is it an education company? Is it a consulting for, are you working on both sides of the marketplace?
Yeah, no, definitely. I wouldn't say education per se. I would say more consulting. Because I think there's a piece of, there's some offshoots of that I think that I also want to focus on. So I think you could, I guess, argue that component is more education oriented, but it's, to me, it's more practical than just sort of education, but, giving people the opportunity to do case studies and do work within their organization and bring it back over a sort of an extended period of time. Right. So there is sort of a real, kind of a, not certification per se, but just some real sort of interesting work. And then I think offshoots of that is empowering those folks. Purpose is another great word that's out there a lot. There's a company called Imperative that I'm doing some work with and getting certified as a purpose coach, because I think there's often a misdefined sort of concept, but I think the purpose and fulfillment component comes into organizations, and coaching is a really critical part of that, and empowering people leaders to sort of be the champions of a coaching style of management and leadership. And bringing that into the organization, I think is super powerful from an impact and ultimately results point of view. And then as well, just, from a overall consulting around the people strategy and people spectrum, whether it's platforms, policies, training, learning, development, compensation, is it PEO, is it ASO, is it in-house, is it going the other way, right? Sort of how do we think about these things in a broader context? And the culture and value stuff is critical as well.
So you're marrying the two, right? So you're talking, the last part of yours was sort of fundamental operational HR meets a different thinking around strategic HR.
Correct.
And how to get organizations to think about that, but also the people within their organizations. Or I imagine the extension of this or a tentacle of this could be a matchmaking. Like, you're not going to be a recruiter, but you have a client that's looking for a head people person, and that's innovative, that's looking for someone with these kind of qualities. If they're not out there in the masses, you're going to be you're going to build a community of these folks. And so I imagine there's some connection there too.
Absolutely.
Well, very cool. I mean, purpose is interesting, right? So great book by Salim Ismail, who runs Singularity University, Exponential Organizations. One of the key factors. So they studied Uber and Airbnb, although, you know, it's sacred. It's sacrilegious to mention Uber these days, but they're still, you know, the ride sharing company. You know, Lyft is obviously making a push with help of Google there, but they found out that purpose is actually one of the key components of success of these exponential organizations, like having a set purpose. And this is not like, hey, we have a mission statement on our wall and we're good. This is really having a defined purpose. So it's interesting because I think we're still going through a transition there. Like, I don't think CEOs are waking up saying, I'm going to call Barry because I need, you know, a purpose. They are, but they're not going to pay for it. Where, you know, it's like, hey, by the way, this is actually, there's a correlation to business success in having a real strong purpose. Get your act together and start doing these kind of things. So it's interesting that you're focusing in that too.
Yeah.
Well, cool. So I'm you know, we're butting up against 45 minutes. Anything you want to talk about? So I truly feel, and I designed an innovation sprint for HR. I kind of borrowed it from the work I did at Razorfish to do innovation for some of our clients. And it's this idea of taking HR departments and identifying some of the people challenges and really developing innovative programs that could result either in a program or technology. I feel like we're still not there. The HR department doesn't work in an agile functionality. They sort of just, they take too long around programs. Anything that you've done around innovation that you want to talk about? I love profiling really interesting programs or things that you've folks have done that are considered innovative from an HR perspective.
Yeah, I think maybe a couple of quick things. I'll keep them short. But I think, you know, again, coming back to culture and values, I think people mistakenly conflate those two. And I think they're super important to codify early and codify well. Culture and culture traits are sort of the behavior and personality of the organization. Values are the North Star of trade-offs and choices, right? And those two have to work together, but they're distinct and different. And so when I came into Axial, we had 5 values, but no statement of culture. And so to help kind of codify that, I hired a psychologist to come in and interview about 60% of the organization to just help us call out of the people that were there and help us identify the culture that was, right? Because these exercises are not about creating it. It's identify who you are. Right. Call it
Which
what
is
it
often a mistake, right? Because when people think culture, we're going to create it. It's going to be top down. It's going to be pushed into the organization. So you're interesting. You're taking it not only from a groundswell perspective, but literally going into the psyche of the employees that have built this startup and saying, okay, maybe there's something in there that we can identify.
Yeah, and it was a great exercise, and really, I highly recommend that kind of approach, especially if you're new to an organization or organization is just for the first time thinking about it. And then you have to sort of find organic ways that are appropriate for that organization to weave that into the fabric of who they are. I'm definitely not a fan of putting up posters or writing it on the wall because then it dies. It's got to be experienced and lived and breathed. So that's one. You know, I think the other thing I bring sort of this, you know, it's funny, you started talking about the plumbing, heating and plumbing. And I look at, often for new hires, I would talk to them on their first day about the role of the people operations team. Like, what do we exist for? And I made it super clear that we exist to drive what I sort of call discretionary impact, right? And sort of, so I think defining early what your team is about and setting the stage of expectations that you shouldn't expect HR to be the fun police or compliance, but you should expect HR or people operations to be the one that's helping and empowering and enabling the organization to be successful and crush the bottom line.
Which is fundamentally different in how HR exists today and has existed, right? It's always been the barrier to these things, like the company check versus the enabler. So that's great.
Yeah. And then the last thing I'll mention was something that I started doing kind of, I think probably maybe late last year, early this year, was changing exit interviews from a list of like just 10 questions to cold data, and shifted away from that and basically moved to a storytelling approach, and asking people to plot on a graph their journey with the company and what the inflection points were and why. and then sort of dig into those inflection points. And the line that sort of goes across sort of the vertical axis, I don't have a consistent way to describe it other than I would say, whatever the thing you experienced working here that had the most volatility. So if you want to call that engagement or satisfaction, whatever you call that, whatever had the most volatility, I want you to plot that line. And let's talk about those inflection points and then dig in a little further and understand what can we as a leadership team take away from that to change or do differently. And I found that just sort of really kind of opened up an interesting dialogue with people that you wouldn't get at if you were asking rote questions.
Right. Yeah. Like what 0 to 5, how is this or that? It's interesting because then you can find out, because what we did at Razorfish is when we were trying to reinvent performance management, we did something similar, not on exits, but with existing employees, and found this sort of cycle where people are challenged and then they're stagnant, and really trying to identify through technology. We had a really great program, but just we couldn't get the support from a budget perspective to do the technology, but we would be able to plot basically what you're talking about, but in real time for every employee that's in the organization. So you can, instead of doing it at exit, which is like, great, this is going to help me fix everything forward. How do I fix it now? Right. How do I manage that situation now? Or, at some point, I'm a true believer in there are fundamentally exits. Like, people need to exit organizations, not for poor performance. It's just what their expectation is doesn't match what the company can do, and there's just no way to really fill that gap. So that's great. I love that thought process, and it's like you don't hear a lot of that. You hear, and I think exit surveys are easy. I think we often take the easy way out of HR. Like, hey, what are you doing over there? We're doing exits. All right, that's what we're going to do. So I love that thought. Cool. So so new business, you're getting out there. So obviously, how can folks find you? How can they connect with you if they want to talk about, consulting or the work that you're doing? How do folks reach out to you?
Yeah. Email address is barry@p7ic.com. So the name of the company I set up is P7 Integrative Consulting. And the P is because there are 7 letters of P in sort of how I define what I want to focus on. And it's really about empowering organizational impact through passionate, purposeful people, obviously people being central, who are powerful producers and peak performers.
Got it. Now say that 10 times, really.
Exactly.
Yeah, very cool. Well, that's great. People get in touch. So last, you probably know, and most folks know, we end the show. New York is a great place for food, but it's even a better place for pizza. And HR folks are real busy. So oftentimes we're eating at our desks, especially if you're in a startup. Man, the lunch date is just doesn't exist anymore. So you're busy on a Wednesday. You have a meeting at 1. You need a quick 2 slices of pizza. Where are you going? What's your favorite pizza by the slice location?
Two Brothers.
Two Brothers. That's very popular. And what the question is, which Two Brothers?
It depends on where I'm at.
So it's always it's generic. It's like there's always a Two Brothers somewhere, right?
There are a bunch of them. Yeah. It's
fascinating because there's never 3 brothers or 4 brothers or 5. It's always just 2. I mean, I guess that's in the Italian households. Like I was brought up, only 2 is the max in terms of getting something done. So 2 brothers, I like that. So, well, cool, Barry. Any parting words for our audience is New York. It's outside of New York. It's HR. It's not HR. Anything you want to tell folks before we get off?
Wow, that's a very broad question. No,
7 P's again. Let's try the 7 P's again.
Yeah, exactly. No, look, I think this is such a cool and exciting space. I love what you guys are doing with these interviews and just sort of getting the word out there and providing an opportunity for thought leadership and discussion. I think it's needed, right? I think there's a great need for it because I think organizations, and we didn't touch on this, but from a talent attraction retention perspective, in the technology space, you have to be competitive, right? And everyone's trying to attract the same talent. And I know some of your other folks have talked about sort of talent pool comparisons in different markets.
Sure.
But at the end of the day, I think the people function is uniquely positioned to really help companies differentiate themselves, both in terms of performance and from an employer brand perspective. And I think that's sort of, those need to be sort of what we focus on, and helping organizations be successful. And offshoots of that, if we're doing it well, are that we'll be attracting talent that's uniquely attracted to each of those organizations, and coming in and with passion and purpose in mind to really have an impact.
Cool. Well, great parting words. I mean, basically the last 20 years of struggle as an HR person, summarized in about 2 minutes there. So that was great. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. So I'll leave it at that. I won't add anything. Barry, thank you so much for being part of our show. Tell your friends, New York HR, we're back here next week. Exciting person coming up. We're going to announce it on our Twitter handle. Again, follow us on Twitter, New York HR, at New York HR. Look for our hashtag, Bada Bing. Barry, good to see you, man. Thanks for joining the show.
You bet. Thank you.
Talk to you soon.
Yep.
Take care.